in Szombathely, and next summer we plan another session in June. And if somebody cannot come to New Zealand, there's no problem, because as soon as they got the form. Yeah, okay. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome you to Budapest. Welcome you to Hungary. Welcome you to the inaugural session of the new Austrian School of Economics. I would like to introduce to you, if you didn't know him already, Philip Barton is the president of the Gold Standard Institute, which is headquartered in Vienna. Philip, we welcome you here. I would also like to introduce my assistant professors who are going to give one or more lectures as we go. It will make the announcement in due course later. Rudy Fritsch from Canada. Peter van Koppenolle from Belgium. And Sandeep Jetli from London. He's originally from India, but he lives in London, and he has been active for the past few years. Welcome. And welcome to all of you. I guess we have enough time to get acquainted. Everybody will be able to make acquaintances of all the others. Now, I was expecting my wife Judith. She just disappeared, but she will say a few words about our future plans. But we already run pretty late, so I guess I just start, and if she comes, she can pick it up. Obviously, you are all aware that this is the present session, which is a 10-day or 20-course session, is just 1/4 of a program, at the end of which we are promising to give you a diploma, subject to a formal written examination after completion of the 4 courses. So we hope that you will like this session. And Judith, this is my wife, Judith, and helper, Judith. She has done a great deal of work. I guess most of you have been dealing with her, and she's going to continue. If you have any problem, just ask her. Hopefully you get her phone number and cell phone number as well, mobile phone number. Judith, we are going to ask you to say a few words about our longer term plans. So we have plans for November this year to meet again in New Zealand. Now don't get frightened. Number one, the distance may be much greater than to North America, but we found out to our great pleasure that the airfare, at least from Budapest, is cheaper than flying to North America. I don't know how long it will last, but I asked Louis to come here because he is Canadian, a French Canadian, but he has lived in New Zealand for the past
24 years.
24 years. So, but New Zealand is just a wonderful country. We have been there and we can testify to that. And if you can, by all means come, because you won't regret it. It's just an experience of a lifetime. And we don't know what kind of world this is going to be and how much trouble we'll have both in Europe and in North America. But it seems to me that New Zealand will be a peaceful place no matter what happens. And if I was younger, I would certainly try to relocate there, but at my age it's probably not a good proposition. So Louis, we have been talking about this for some time, that we'll have a 10-day, 20-course session of the new Austrian School of Economics in New Zealand, more particularly on the South Island. Has something happened in the meantime?
I think it would be easiest to attract as many New Zealanders and maybe Australians as well to attend if we could have a moving or rotating site for the 2 weeks. 1 week in Auckland, for example, 3 days in Wellington and 2 days in Christchurch, or something like that.
Christchurch is on the South Island.
Christchurch is on the South Island.
And Wellington and Auckland, North Island.
Yeah.
But both are fantastic. I mean, we haven't been to the South Island, but the North Island is also fantastic, and people say the South Island is at least as interesting. So,
and the interest is there. I think there's a number of people who know of your work, Professor, of you, and what you've done in previous years in Australia. So hopefully we'd be able to attract some attendees from Australia as well. But I can't see any difficulty in gathering a reasonable number of people, especially if we do it this way, as opposed to 2 weeks in one location. Mm-hmm. That's an idea. But so far it's not finalized. But it would be the earlier part of November.
Earlier part, yeah, very good. Because on the second part,
because at the end of November, the professor and I are presenting a paper at the Society of Actuaries, New Zealand. I'm an actuary, and I present a paper every time they have a conference. And this year, I'm presenting with the professor a paper on the role of gold as a numeraire.
Well, thank you very much. Any question about New Zealand?
Do you know the exact dates?
No, not yet.
No, not yet, but it would be in the first half of November.
Okay.
Very likely.
And we'll make an announcement in due course, so you won't miss it if you keep an eye on, for example, on my website or on the Gold Standard Institute website.
If amongst you the first half of November is not a good time, give us the feedback, and maybe we can think of slightly alternating depending on how available you are, Professor.
Very good.
The paper you're presenting as goals as a numeraire,
Yeah.
is it already written? Or does
No.
it still have to be?
No, the professor is going to write it for, no, it's not written yet. But
It's in there.
it's, yes,
All right.
it's all there. Thank you.
Now, Judith will say a few words to you, just if you have any lingering doubts that you may be able to come as far as New Zealand, because that would not interfere with your plan to complete the program, which, as I explained, will be of 4 courses. So will you just explain?
Would you like to sit here?
No.
First of all, our actual experience is that it is much more comfortable in Szombathely. Many of them were already in Szombathely, where everything is at the same place. Everybody is staying together, and the food is good and a nice place. Here it is quite hectic. And what we planned is that we will have a next Hungarian session in March, in Szombathely, in Martinium at Szombathely in March. And you must know that always Antal, when he's writing a new article, it is immediately put to his web page. Is anybody who doesn't know his web page? www.professorfekete.com, and here there is a flag event, news and events or something like this, and here is a complete announcement of the different comings, and he always has put announcements after his new articles about the gatherings. So then we thought that perhaps the next one we should do in June, because this time many people are on holiday and couldn't come because of that. And I don't know what about the students, because as I got to know, the German students hasn't still finished their semester. The last semester they hasn't finished yet. So I don't know whether it is okay for them in June. I will try to make some investigation about this. But actually we think it should be in June. And then again, during the autumn, we plan to make the fourth course. But if you miss the second course in New Zealand, then you could come to the next one, because we will rotate it like this, and you can come to the second course of the next set. Okay? So that is how we see actually the things.
Thank you very much. Any question about the future plans? Well, there will be other opportunities. If you have later something occurs to you, you will have lots of opportunities to ask the question. So, well, as I say, we are running behind schedule, but no worry. We will have our coffee break. I hope the coffee is brewing and will be ready in an hour's time. And there will be cookies and whatever. And this will be the routine during the rest of the session. 1 hour lecture in the morning, followed by half an hour coffee break, and after the coffee break we come back here and have the discussion period. So today we'll be running half an hour late, but as I say, there's no problem. However, in the future lectures, I would like to keep to the timetable, which means 9:30 sharp in the morning. I would like to start the lecture, and we should be ready by 12 at the very latest, probably 11:30, but if we run a little bit late, it's no problem, 12:30. And then everybody is on her or his own for lunch. We have showed people around the little restaurant just cross the street, but you have other choices too. And in the afternoon, the first thing is the lecture, 2:30 sharp. Here, all lectures and discussions are in this room. And followed by a coffee break, half an hour, and the discussion period. So by 4:30 or latest 5 o'clock, we should be finishing the second session, and you will be able to, I hope, do a little bit of sightseeing on your own, taking the streetcar downtown. You will be able to see a lot of things. If you cross the river Danube, you'll be able to see the other bridges and a pretty good view of the Buda, the hilly side of the city, whereas Pest is flat, but Buda is hilly. We are probably going to organize some sightseeing for Saturday and Sunday. We'll talk about this later. But in the meantime, you will have these evenings, and I would recommend that you do a little bit of sightseeing on your own. You don't have to have a set plan what you want to see. Just take the streetcar, and if you like something, you can get off. There are lots of churches, fine churches and other buildings, government buildings, parliament building, royal palace, because Hungary used to be a kingdom, no longer, but Budapest does have a royal palace, which now is used for other purposes such as gallery and library and others. There are lots of summer festivals going on right now. We'll give you a little bit of information on that in the coming days. So, welcome. We are very happy that you are here. We hope you can make most of it. I'm trying to do my best, and my assistants as well, to give you something valuable. The first lecture, which I'm going to deliver now, is available, as you may already have a copy of your own, and I cannot promise to have the continuation as detailed as this one. I have the second and third one is comparable to this, but the rest will be just 1 or at most 2 pages. However, I'm going to write it up with the help of Rudy, and we'll make it available to you also. As you may have noticed, we have a cameraman, actually 2, right? Rudy is the boss, and he has an assistant.
I'm the director.
Okay, you are the director.
Take a picture.
All right.
I don't have the right hat.
So this means that DVD will be available in due course, but that's not in my hands. So if you want to know more about this, I guess it's Daryl and Martha, who are unfortunately not with us, but some of you might have met them.
Actually, they're not involved this time, Professor. I'm going to be doing that.
You are going to do
Yeah,
that.
and I don't expect anything too fancy. I said I'm an editor, but I was kidding. What you'll get is a transcript of this whole class, hopefully with good audio, good video, and just, session by session. There's a label at the beginning and another one at the end that says end. Beginning, end. Nothing fancy. But the information will be there, and of course, what he says, if you miss something or don't understand something, you can replay. And he mentioned something about writing up a transcript. We're thinking about writing a book or a small book that will take these concepts and perhaps expand them and explain them a little better, and that will be part of the video package. And I think that's one out. So Daryl, Martha are not involved this time. If there's any problem, you can blame me.
Thank you. All right, let's get started. The title of the course about the coordination problem in economics is maybe a little bit too forbidding, but we'll try to make it accessible to everybody. I will explain why this is important now in the introductory part. We have to have a proper foundation of economics. Some of the fundamental ideas have to be clarified. This is the modern scientific method. You start with certain axioms which you explain, and then after that you build on these axioms. And that's what I'm trying to do. But as I say, don't consider this as something which is frightening. Just consider this as something that is important in order to structure knowledge properly, which is very similar to structuring construction of a high-rise building. You've got to have a proper foundation which then, once in place, can carry the weight of the superstructure, the knowledge which we are going to build. The title of the school includes the words Austrian School of Economics. So it's only proper to mention the name of Karl Menger, who lived from 1840 to 1921. We honor him as the founder, as the founding father of the Austrian School of Economics, which today has a renaissance, a rebirth, a new chapter, because the world is at a rather bad juncture, having this great financial crisis, which is the result of economics just opposing the views of Karl Menger and his followers. Now, there has been Austrian school in the meantime, continuously after Karl Menger, but it was declining because of the influence of the Keynesian and Friedmanite theories. And why I call this a new Austrian school of economics is because, in my opinion, the present protagonists of the Austrian school, and I specifically think of the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, have perhaps deviated from Menger. But even if they haven't, they don't have an open mind. And one issue in particular came up, and I think this calls for clarification. And the issue was the so-called real Bill's doctrine of Adam Smith. Of course, Adam Smith lived long before Menger and other Austrians, and Adam Smith had a share of mistakes which he has made, in particular the theory of value which he established turned out to be a rather bad mistake. His theory of value, Adam Smith's theory of value, is the cost-based, so-called objective theory of value. Cost-based because he explains value in terms of the cost of input in order for something such as a cup or a cup of wine, what have you, in order to have the value defined, he refers to the cost of factors going into the production. And that turned out to be a mistake which Menger rectified. Menger came up with the subjective theory of value. This is the modern concept of value. It's subjective because no reference to costs or objective factors are made. It's the individual. The English saying is that beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. So Menger turned this around and says, value is in the eyes of the beholder. Nothing else matters. If you can have a most costly production of something, but if the beholder doesn't see the beauty or the value, then this value just doesn't exist. It's just figment of the imagination. Now, you might say this was a quibble among theoreticians, but it wasn't, because millions or even hundreds of millions of people had to die simply because Karl Marx took over the mistake which Adam Smith innocently enough made, because Adam Smith wasn't aware of the catastrophic consequences once a revolutionary takes over a mistaken idea and runs with it. It could wipe out populations of whole countries, as it did in the Soviet Union and other countries, in consequence of Karl Marx, his theoretical work, and his advocating the dictatorship of the proletariat, which also happened in this country for 50 years. It was under the yoke of the Soviet Union, and you can see, because this country is still a very poor country if you take a closer look.
He actually could be said to have refined Adam Smith's concept down to just the labour input of creating the value.
The labour input. Well, I'm not saying that he took it over and made no changes. No. He took it over and made appropriate changes, but the authorship of the original idea is unmistakable. It's Adam Smith. You see? So we are talking about mistakes which could have tremendous repercussion and historic cost and all that. So this is one of the great things about Karl Menger, and we salute him. And there are others, and in laying the foundation here in this course, I just have to point this out to you, that we will take every opportunity to point out our roots, how it goes back to the thought of Karl Menger. We are not doctrinaires, and this is one thing I criticize in the Ludwig von Mises Institute, which is also Austrian, but they are too doctrinaire, too dogmatic, they even consider it as a sacrilege to criticize some of the ideas of Ludwig von Mises, which is a great economist of the 20th century, a little bit a generation after Karl Menger. I am one of his admirers, but there are certain mistakes he made. I'm not going to say whether the mistake was greater or lesser than the mistake of Adam Smith. Let's just say that there were mistakes, and I have been bold enough to point it out, and as a consequence I've been given a bad name. And you know the other English proverb, what happens to a dog who's been given a bad name? Yes. Might as well shoot him. Well, nobody has shot at me so far, but I am aware that the consequences could be very serious of criticizing when you have such a dogmatic, such a doctrinaire group of people. All right. So
the main point there, isn't it, is that the consequences of economic untruths are also profound. So you have to say what you say.
Yeah, that's what I believe, but I'm not saying everybody would agree with that. But I think even if I'm wrong, and I'm not saying that I cannot be wrong, of course I can be, and I think if Mises was alive, he would say that too about himself. He would welcome a debate, and I think that's the way knowledge marches forward, that there are controversial statements, there are critiques, and then they get together and in an open debate. Even if they cannot agree at the end, there's something positive coming out of this, and in time, obviously, there will be resolution.
Yeah.
And I think that's how knowledge has developed, knowledge has evolved over the centuries or even thousands of years. You know, I wear two hats. I'm also a mathematician, and mathematics is often thought about as being the branch of science which par excellence cannot make a mistake, or if somebody makes one, it's easy to point out. Well, that's not so. Mathematics has its own share of mistakes which still linger on. Not all the controversies have been solved within mathematics. And I think economics is also an example of that. So coming back to Menger's idea, he put economics on an axiomatic foundation, which was a revolutionary idea, because economics throughout history has been more like a narrative science, like history, explaining what has happened and putting it in different lights, and so on. Menger said that's not the way. Economics, more like mathematics, is an a priori science. A priori is Latin. It literally means think of the opposite, a posteriori. In other words, there are a priori truths and there are a posteriori truths. There are truths which are imposed on us. They are not revealed by research or by experimentation or by observation. Our whole thinking is structured in such a way that these a priori truths have to be accepted, whereas a posteriori truth is something which you arrive at after study, research, observation, experimentation. And these two methods of inquiry have to be sharply separated. The two won't mix. In mathematics, you can say that this is true because I've checked it 1,000 examples, and that's pretty convincing to me. That this is no good, not good enough, because there are infinitely many cases you would have to check, and human life is not long enough to go through this. So in other words, mathematics is a priori, because you cannot say that I do experiments and I make a conclusion and that is it. This is not acceptable. It could be acceptable in biology, could be acceptable in sociology and many other branches of science, but in mathematics and in logic, these two a priori branches of science are definitely not. So the revolution Menger made was that he said there's a third branch of science where the truth has to be arrived at through a priori reasoning, and this is economics. So he started his restructuring of economics by setting up axioms, in particular two axioms. And if you refer to the first page of my syllabus, the first axiom is known as the axiom of increasing utility. And I just read, an economizing individual, if he has to choose between two portions of the same good or same commodity, will, other things being the same, choose the larger portion. And even animals do that. If you make a dog understand that he has no choice but take one piece of bone or another piece of bone, cannot have both, then he will pick the bigger one. Now human beings are the same, but we have to put in that little clause, other things being the same, because for instance, you could bribe the economizing individual to choose the smaller portion just to be controversial. Or it could be that the economizing individual knows a little bit more. He knows that the bigger piece of chunk of food is already in an advanced stage of deterioration and the other is fresh. So, but other things being the same, the economizing individual will choose the larger portion. I don't think this is controversial. And we call this axiom of increasing utility because what we think of is value. Utility is, in a way, synonymous to the word value. And the question is, how is the individual valuing goods? And the answer is he's valuing goods according to an increasing curve. An increasing curve. I just have to go to the board and test my new we have been securing this board here, and we got the what's the word for that?
The textile. Textile.
Loránt. And so let's think of a coordinate system, and the horizontal axis is quantity. I use a Q for that. And this could be U for utility, but value is a synonym for that, so we can think of that. And according to this first axiom, this curve is going to be an increasing curve, something like this. Now, could have a different shape, could be rising faster. And it could be linear too, and that's a very important special case which we are going to return to. It's a special case of this one. Okay? So this is what the first axiom says. The utility curve, which shows you utility as function of quantity, is a rising curve. That was the easier axiom, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the much, much more complicated axiom comes, axiom number 2, which made Carl Menger very, very famous. In fact, he was one of 3 economists who thought about that. There was another one, of course, Menger was Austrian, but there was a Swiss by the name of Walras. I'm not going to write down because we are not going to bother with Walras, but he came up with a similar idea, which axiom number 2, and then the Englishman Jevons. But again, I'm just mentioning that there are actually 3 economists accredited, but by and far it was Menger who put it into the right context. And we call it today the axiom of declining marginal utility. So I'm going to read this, but I want to make sure that everybody understands, because this is something which I definitely want you to take back with you. And then I'm going to ask the question that, are you sure you understand it? If not, please ask questions and so on. So the axiom of declining marginal utility says that an economizing individual having a number of equal portions of the same good at his command will assign these equal portions to the satisfaction of different needs in order of decreasing priority. So, before I ask you whether you think you've understood this, I'm going to give you at least one example, but actually I will ask Sandy, because last year we were both lecturing in San Francisco, and he mentioned an example which how this is applicable to a real life situation, and then I mentioned another example which was a little bit more elaborate. Would you like to say at least one, and if
yes,
both? Yeah,
absolutely. I think the example that I gave was the use of water. So it was actually used to answer the paradox which had been around for a number of years, which was why diamonds were more valuable than water, even though water was essential for human life. And the way you have to look at it is effectively satisfaction of each need. So water obviously satisfies various human needs. Now, from the assumption that you don't have access to water to begin with, each need that is satisfied allows you to move on to the next sort of, the next choice or the next subjective framework for you to use the water. So for example, if you have no access to water currently, and you suddenly do, your first use of it will be to quench your own thirst. So what do you do once you've quenched your own thirst? You know, well, depending upon the situation, it might be do the washing up. You know, I've quenched my thirst, I've got some dirty dishes, so I want to do some washing up. Now, what do you do once you've done your washing up and the water is sufficient to satisfy that need? You move on to the next need. And each need is by definition less important than the previous need. So it's not the most important need that determines the value of the water, it's the least important need, because by definition all the other needs have been satisfied. But were that not to be the case, then that would not be the least important need, it would be one step up. So that was the quite basic example that I gave. But again, if you think about it in terms of not just that descriptive example, but in terms of substance and material, you know, satisfying the thirst of a person will take much more volumetrically than each successive application. So you will have, let's say, most water going in terms of volume to satisfy human thirst, and only a minute amount, say, to water the flowers. Yet people who are classically based in terms of determining sort of absolute value would assume that because most of the water is being used to quench your thirst, that determines the value, when it's not. You know, that is regardless, and so that develops into the concept of starts to flow, which is another way of looking at marginal utility. It's like looking at that example in a mirror, as it were.
All right, now at that time in San Francisco, California last year, I interrupted Sandeep and came up with another example which originally goes back to Menger himself, but it has been improved. Well, can you improve on Menger? Anyhow, has been changed a little bit around, and I like this example because you can see very clearly the equal portions of the goods and how they are put to different uses, or how they are earmarked for different uses. So the example is about a farmer in a remote part of Brazil, somewhere in the middle of the jungle. He clears a plot of land and he grows, say, wheat. And at harvest time he brings in exactly 6 sacks. I think the number was 6, if not, will turn out at the end. But it doesn't matter. A number of sacks of wheat. And they are equal in weight, in quality, everything. But he is going to earmark each sack for a different purpose. The first sack is earmarked for the most important purpose he has, which is survival. He wants to survive, he and his family, till the next harvest, when he will have another supply, but in the meantime he will have no possibility to replenish. If a flood takes all 6 sacks, or the barn burns down and the wheat is gone, then he will have to starve and probably die. So that's the top priority to secure his survival, is the first sack, to feed his family himself. The second sack he earmarks for fodder, to feed animals. He has a couple of animals, maybe cows as well, and he will feed the second sack to these animals. Maybe also chicken. That doesn't matter. You get the idea that he has animals, and the fodder comes from the second sack. The third sack is earmarking for making whiskey. That's not necessarily for survival, but he had a good harvest, so he can afford to think of that use as well. So that's the third sack. The fourth sack is earmarking for feeding the birds. There are some birds around who come, and unless he puts out the seeds, they won't come. But this is their only entertainment. They have no television, no radio, nothing but the birds watching their antiques. Is that the word, antique? The bird.
Antics.
Antics.
Never heard of it.
And listening to their songs gives them entertainment, and they can afford, because there's a fourth sack. So it seems to me that 5 is the number. There is a fifth sack which he has no use for. So if conditions are present to take that fifth sack, which is a surplus, so to speak, to a very, very distant market, then he will do that. Because he doesn't have any personal need for the fifth sack. Or if there are 6, then 2 surplus sacks, which he takes to the market. Now, question, what value will he put on this 5th and 6th sack when he arrives, if he ever arrives to this distant market? Well, he cannot put the high value, which is survival, because there's so many other stages in between. So he will put the value on the surplus sack, which is the marginal value, which is, just the value which the marginal use is to feed it to the birds, you see. However, if his barn burns down and 3 of the 6 sacks is gone, up in smoke, then the value will be very, very different. Because then he will have to consider that, okay, we have animals. Oh, I'm sorry, the number is 6 because the second sack is not animal, it's the seed grain. I'm so sorry. But you understand that he will feed his family even before he puts aside the seed grain. And the second is not feed the pigs or the cows or the chicken, but to have seed grain for the next harvest. Very important. How could I forget that?
It didn't seem dignified to dig it.
So you see, if he loses 3 of the 6 sacks, then he has to revamp his priorities completely, and he will value that sack, the marginal sack, much more, because there could be the seed grain involved or feeding animals, and forget about whiskey, forget about singing birds and all the rest, because these are his priorities. So that's how he will assign the equal portions of his inventory of a certain good. And this is very convincing to me, and I hope it is to you as well. And that's the case with everything. You can think of any number of examples. It will always be like that. It will always be like that. Now you might say that if you have a Sanskrit grammar and you have 5 identical copies, what will you do? Well, the answer is you need 1 only, and the rest is surplus. So you either give it away or sell it if you can, and so on. But in most cases, you can do with more than 1 portion of the same good, and that is exactly how you will assign value to the different portions. They are identical in every way. There's no way to distinguish between them, but yet the human mind is structured in such a way that it will assign different utility to different uses because of that. And we call this, with a rather forbidding technical name, declining marginal utility, because the first utility has a very high priority, but as you go along, you get lesser and lesser. So that this example may be very helpful, and the example which Sandy gave, why is it that water is so much more important for the survival of human beings than diamond, yet we put a much higher value on diamond and a ridiculously low value on water. Again, you just have to refer to this axiom of declining marginal utility. Now, I give you a little secret how to understand these 2 technical concepts a little bit better. But before I do, I just drew another graph. This is the utility curve. And I'm going to draw a marginal utility curve which will be declining. And it will be declining and approaches 0. So in that case I could say MU, marginal utility, is declining. It's always positive, but gets smaller and smaller and smaller, ever smaller. The little secret I want to give you, please keep it, because that's my trading stock, and I'm going to repeat this lecture elsewhere. But of course, I'm joking, because if you let it be known, and the whole world will know this, it will help the cause, and I don't care. People will still come to me and listen to me. Now, this utility connotes with total price, which this is marginal utility, and that connotes with somebody with unit price. And there's a big difference between the two. When you talk about total price, you just go to the market and there is a pile of potatoes and you don't care whether it's 15 kilograms or 16 kilograms. You just say, that's about the amount I need, so you bargain with the seller for the total, for the lot. How much do you want for this? He doesn't care about unit price because he has the supply, he wants it. So that's the total price. But more often than not, you just go to the seller in the market, open air market somewhere, and there's this pile, and you know you only have need for a basketful. So you say, okay, what is your unit price? In order to be able to make a judgment whether you want to buy from that one or from the other one. And then you are talking about unit price. So I think this is a very obvious distinction you as a shopper will have to make between the total price of some commodity and the unit price. A different mindset. Okay. Now, I'm suggesting it to you that in order to understand marginal utility, you think of the unit price. And it's common experience that if you buy one egg, they quote you one price. If you buy a dozen eggs, they quote you a lower price. And that's just declining marginal utility for you. And if you want to buy a dozen, which used to have a name in English and other languages.
A gross, yes.
That's
good.
Then you get an even lower price, you see, and this is pretty common in every market. If you buy more, you get a different unit price, namely a lower unit price. So this I found very useful myself, to think of utility and marginal utility in terms of total price and unit price. And that brings out why one is increasing, but at a progressively lower rate, because the rate is determined by marginal utility, okay, which is declining, and there you have it. This is Axiom 1, and this is Axiom 2. Would you like to ask any questions at this stage? Yes?
Will you consider the farmer with the 6 sacks of wheat, all the 6, that's the total price, and the unit price is the price of the first sack, and the unit price or unit value of the second sack, and that's what's declining? Is that how you're looking at it?
No, the unit price is the surplus. So you have to have surplus, which you take to the market. The first 5 sacks are not surplus. You use it for your own personal use. Partly survival, partly entertainment, partly just feeling good. But it should not be considered a surplus unless, for some reason, you lose some units. And then you reclassify the whole thing. So marginal utility is always the last sack which determines the value. And that's the importance of this axiom. The marginal utility is the last sack which you can reclassify as surplus if you have to. It's not the first sack, it's not the second sack, but it's always the last sack, and that is going to govern your thinking. What is an acceptable price which the other party is willing to pay you? And that gives you the leeway, the possibility of making up your mind. Yes, Peter.
In classical economics, I was, if I remember correctly, I was given the example of students who went to a party and who offered their services as bartenders. And the example given was one bartender had this amount of utility that was fine, but it was not enough. And the second one coming in, that was also fine, and productivity increased. Add another one, a third one, and productivity increased still. But up to 5, and then they started falling over each other. And that's when marginal utility, well, I think it went below 0. But it was explained to us as...
That was not marginal utility, that was marginal productivity.
Sorry,
which is something else.
It must have been productivity because you had...
No, you are talking about labor.
Labor.
Productivity of labor.
You're right.
And there are similarities, but it's not the same. And we are still at the foundation. The marginal productivity comes at a later stage. Now, we are not going to discuss it in this course, but if you keep building your knowledge of economics, marginal productivity comes later.
And it will go below 0.
Okay.
Gentleman next door.
Yes.
Yes, I never seen this equivalence between price and utility, but I'm thinking in this case, is the same curve for seller and buyers? Because you are talking about price. Price is price for the seller, price for the buyer. It's different, no? Utility.
I do beg your pardon, I didn't quite get that. What? Could you give me the question again?
When you put price in this curve, price, no utility, price.
Yeah.
Price. You are talking about price is a price for the buyer or for the seller.
Yeah.
Is the same
Didn't ask.
curve in this case? Is the same curve for the seller or for the buyer? For me, is because utility is utility. Utility is value. Is absolute.
Sandeep, can you help with
Price is
this?
relative.
I think Sandeep can help with this.
Okay. Well, first of all, if you're buying something, someone has to sell it to you. So you know, this is for example, it's describing cleared prices, not So if you have a series where you have prices that have been observed, then it doesn't matter.
I understand, but my question is about absolute content like utility. It's a content. But price is relative.
No, price. Yeah, okay. You can't talk about price until you've actually determined what that is. But until you've actually got that substance, okay, which you use to define the other substances. So the professor will go on to it later. You can only talk about price once you've established that substance which has near enough constant marginal utility, because then everything can be expressed as it were, in terms of that substance. That substance has to exist, because just like the largest number in a set of numbers has to exist. And I'll let the professor talk about that later on. But yeah.
There's no dollar price or money price here yet. He's talking about utility to the farmer. The dollar price or indirect exchange price will arise from multiple sellers and buyers coming to their own conclusions. So if the farmer here, the 3 sacks are burned, it's priceless. He's not selling it for any price. See, so you have to be careful not to confuse that with a dollar or a numeraire price. This is, when you're looking at value, and what the professor put in brackets is just another way to look at this. But it's not, he didn't say dollar signs, that 1 sack of wheat would...
Yeah, well, what was the price of your lack of death, as it were?
Excuse me, you cannot put you cannot measure value, you can only compare it.
No.
Your first sack is more valuable than the second. So I think there's...
I'm afraid I have to close this discussion now because I was really looking for short questions, but anyhow, I'm going to have a break in about 5 minutes, so I want to say a few things, and then I haven't covered even half of what I was going to say in this first lecture. So after the break, I'm going to continue lecturing. I'm sorry about that, but I just have to cover a certain amount of material. But before we go for a coffee break, I would like to point out to you that why I was so secretive about this interpretation, total price and unit price, as an explanation for the concept of utility on the one hand and marginal utility on the other. The reason is that in a way we are putting the cart before the horse, because the real reason why Karl Menger brought in these 2 axioms very early in the discussion is because he wanted to explain the origin of money. Now, if you don't have money, there's no way to talk about prices, because what is a price? A price is a measure of the exchange rate between the good, subject to trade, and the monetary commodity. So if you don't have monetary commodity, because it's still a very, very primitive society, there's no way to talk about price. So you are putting the cart before the horse if you bring in this. But I thought this was still worth taking the chance that, we anticipate that there will be eventually a price and there will be a market, and we graduate from what you call direct exchange, which is barter, to indirect exchange, which is buying and selling against money, monetary commodity. So that is the reason. Now, for the benefit of those of you, few as there may be, who are either mathematically inclined or have a little bit of exposure to what they call in America calculus, for a lot of various sciences, people have to take calculus. I would like to point out that there is a mathematical relation between the utility curve and the marginal utility curve. Can you tell me what this relation is?
The slope. The slope.
The more technical derivative or the differential quotient. Question, which of the 2 curves is the differential quotient or the derivative, more commonly known as the derivative?
Marginal utility is
The marginal utility curve is just the first derivative of the utility curve. Okay? Now, I already drew half of the limiting case down there, where the utility curve is a straight line. Okay? Question, what is the marginal utility curve in that limiting case? Now, obviously, you are going to...
I think so.
So, all right. A straight line, in fact, a horizontal. Right?
Yes.
Yes. And this is very important, because this means that marginal utility can be constant. Which you might say contradicts the axiom which says that it must be declining in every case. However, as a limiting case, we might just say that the marginal utility declines ever so slowly that it's practically constant. Theoretically it may not be, but for all practical purposes the decline is so small that we are just as well consider it as constant. So I have to put that in. Constant marginal utility, which has the result that the utility curve is a straight line with a slope, and actually the slope is measured by that constant. And this is very useful to consider this. And I would not say it contradicts the axiom. It confirms the axiom as a limiting case. You see, this is the case where if you buy twice as much, it will cost you twice as much. But, you know, in most of the real life examples, this is not true, that if you buy twice as much, which means then it will cost you, because it will cost you less than twice as much. You see, this is increasing, true, but at a declining rate. So this will be the subject of the second lecture tomorrow, how constant marginal utility arises as an ideal, and the monetary commodity will realize that limiting case. And that is going to be gold. But that's tomorrow. But when we come back after half an hour coffee break, I will just continue with a few more things about the first topic, because I just want to put it into context about the idea of coordination and the role of the entrepreneur and so on. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's adjourn for coffee break, which is in the kitchen. You all know the kitchen? Okay, thank you very much.